time once again for Community Forum, and we are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning Andre Taylor. Andre Taylor is founder of the organization Not This Time and chair of De-Escalate Washington, also known as Initiative 940, and he's here to talk about his organization and his work with the initiative. Andre, thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
So start out, tell us about your organization, Not This Time, and your motivation for founding it.
I started my organization, Not This Time, which is a 501c3 and also a 501c4, after the killing of my brother, Shay Taylor, from Seattle Police Department last year, February 21st. I hadn't been home in Seattle for a while. I was living in Los Angeles. And I got a phone call from my brother's mom saying that she believed that he had been shot. And I told her, before we begin to jump to any conclusions about that, let's get some clarity on exactly what happened. She was in Dallas at the time. About 3 hours later, we found out that my brother was not only shot, but that he was dead and made his transition. And that was tough because I've often said before that my little brother is almost like a son. You know, when you're growing up, you wrestle him down and hold him down, and it was very devastating for me and the family. And so I moved back up to Seattle a day later, which was February 21st and 22nd, and did not leave. Moved my wife back, my mother-in-law, my son, and started Not This Time. I had looked at some of the incidences of police-involved shooting around the country, and normally what you see is a reaction because there's historic trauma in communities of color when dealing with police officers. And so there's always an immediate reaction. And, sometimes those reactions aren't the most positive things. And so I felt like, I didn't want to react. I wanted instead to respond to a situation because I wanted to control the narrative. I understood that it was a narrative fight sometimes when people are reacting. And I understand why, because of that pain and that trauma. There's a deflection that happens from the very incident of the police-involved killing to the actions of the community or people acting outside of that. And so people can deflect from the actual shooting, and I didn't want to let that happen. So I remember when I first got here, within the first week, I sat down with the chief of police, Kathleen O'Toole, and I told her that, I know I can't bring my little brother back, but that I'm willing to work with you to reduce the incidences of violence in our community. I know that shocked her because she probably was expecting a reaction instead of a response. And it was important for me to control the narrative so that there could be some real positive dialogue. So we created Not This Time, my wife and I, and we start giving these meetings weekly. And underneath that same narrative of responding and not reacting. And it became very successful in that many politicians would come, police chiefs, King County Prosecutor Dan Satterberg, U.S. Congressman Adam Smith and Lorena Gonzalez, and many police chiefs. And so it was important for me to create this space. Space is a new word. You want to create this space. So we created this space for real dialogue without disrespect, and we were able to bring these law enforcement and bring politicians to the community so that they can let community know their responsibility to them, and that the community could also understand how the system works. I'm a proponent of rallying and marching. I just don't believe that by itself can change things. I think that educating the community on legislation and policy is quite more effective to bring forth change. So during the process of having Not This Time, I thought about what my family had to go through when my brother was killed. And we did not know what to do. It was a very, very troubling time. Even we started to attack one another because of our pain. And I just felt like if I could help it, I'd never want to see another family have to go through what my family has gone through, when your loved one is killed, because you're trying to fight for your family because the narrative is put out there that they're the worst person in the world and responsible for their own death, while you're trying to grieve at the same time, which is a very impossible situation. So that was another reason why creating Not Just Time was very, very important. I wanted to make sure that families, and we did, when Charlena Lyles' family called us the evening that she was killed, we were able to put a legal team around her, support from other families that have gone through exactly what they were going through, and allow them space to grieve and a platform that if they wanted or when they were ready to speak about Charlena, they could. But that immediate, covering was very, very important for this family going through these trials and this trauma. And we've been able to do that to several families that have experienced their loved ones being killed, like days and weeks after Charlena as well. And that's tough. That is a tough process, because I realized that while we were helping these other families, I start feeling the trauma of my own brother's death while I was trying to help them. It's a real, real tough process. And as we say, people that have lost loved ones, that this is a group no one wants to be a part of.
So during that time, you started working on or with an initiative. I think it was 873, the first
Yes.
iteration.
Yes.
Talk about, give us some history on that. How did that come about?
There was a process going forth before I moved back home that people were concerned about what I did not know. The law that we have in Washington State, Amnesty International says, is the most restrictive law in the nation, that we are an actual outlier. There is no state that has the language in the law like our state that gives a de facto immunity for law enforcement officers if they use deadly force. Once I found out that, there were individuals that educated me about the law here. Lisa Dugard, Leslie Cushman gave me an education of why our law is the worst, because we actually have to prove in this state, before we can hold a police officer accountable, that he had malice. And malice is almost an impossible thing to prove, because you, in essence, you're saying that you have to prove what was in an officer's mind, what he was thinking. And so when it was traced back to when this law was instituted in 1986, it was supposed to be an improvement for the law before 1986, which was an officer can actually shoot a fleeing felon in the back. So this was supposed to be an improvement. And actually, it's not an improvement, because it gives a de facto immunity. So there were individuals that were working on this before through the legislation process, and it failed. And so one of the individuals that lived in Olympia, her name was Lisa, she got in contact with me because she had this idea about this initiative process, which I knew nothing about. And so she created 873, and I was one of the main supporters of it, and the Puyallup tribe as well. And we tried to build this coalition together with Native church, with Black churches, Native communities, and Latino communities as well. It was unsuccessful. We didn't have the amount of support or the understanding of how initiative was supposed to operate. But from that experience, we learned, and at the end of the year, last year, we started again, but it was led by me and Lisa Dugard, Leslie Cushman, and Noel Lowney, Gabe Meyer, who was working and continues to work with me to this day. And we spend about 5 months creating this initiative based upon information that people had over several years to make sure that it was tight, to make sure that the initiative was not anti-police but pro-community. And once we were sure about that, we did a statewide poll. And if you're doing a statewide poll and the pollsters say that you have 60% yes, you have a viable initiative. Well, the pollsters came back with a 75% yes around the state. 89% of Democrats, 85% of Democrats, and 69% of Republicans said yes to our initiative, and we knew we had something that was extraordinarily viable. So we went and back to these communities that we were working with the year prior, the Native tribes, and particularly the Puyallup tribes, that were really the ones that got things rolling as far as the financial support and help, Latino organizations and Black community members. And I went and said, we've been working separately on this for a very, very long time, and we've had the same problem, and we need each other more than ever now. Everyone agreed. We built this coalition led by people of color, and thus far it has been extremely successful.
Yeah, it still surprises me the wide range of endorsements and support you've gotten for 940.
Yes, we've built relationships with politicians, and we've had some buy-in from law enforcement. Both sheriffs endorsed it. The mayors has endorsed it. Black law enforcement officers of Washington have endorsed it. Senator Murray called me personally several weeks ago and endorsed it. U.S. Congressman Adam Smith, the list goes on. And we have unions that have endorsed it, $11.99, $7.75, $9.20. It is a beautiful thing when all people come together and say yes to change, and that's what's going on through this initiative.
So break down specifically what will Initiative 940 change?
What's important to us is that, which has been proven, that de-escalation is paramount. So officers sometimes push back and say, well, we already have de-escalation training, some 8 hours, or maybe even 40 hours at the most. And I respond to them and say, I understand, but if you have an officer that has been trained for some 5, 10, 15, 20 years to shoot center mass, and a situation happens, that officer is predisposed to go back to a behavior that she or he is trained with, which is shooting center mass. And those 8 hours or 40 hours are not going to even play out. So we want to give an officer de-escalation training throughout their career so that it's as easy for them to de-escalate as it is for them to pull out their guns. We also want to make sure officers have mental health crises training. It's not fair, in my opinion, that officers are in the street and do not have mental health crises training, because a lot of these police-involved shootings are due to an individual having a crisis. And if an officer is not aware of what he's looking at, he will automatically feel underneath threat and refer back to his training, where this individual could have been talked down or whatever the training will show that is necessary to de-escalate an individual that's having a crisis. We need to give officers that training. I'm not saying they could fix everything, but you can never downgrade training. Training is necessary. We need them to be able to have some mental health crises training so that they can know what to look for and what they're looking at. Also, you would think that this was already a law, that for an officer to render first aid, we don't want him to be an EMT, but if he's first on the scene and the situation happens, they need to be able to have basic training to be able to render first aid. In my brother's case, Shay Taylor, they shot my brother, handcuffed him, and let him bleed out for around 8 minutes. And, that is, I can't even bear thinking about that. But We want to make sure that an officer renders first aid, that preservation of life is paramount. And it also offers independent investigations. And this is very, very important because if an officer is investigating someone that's their friend or they know of, or they know their family and know their children, they've gone camping together and the like, then, you know, it's not going to be a fair process. If you ask me to investigate my best friend, it's going to be very difficult. And to prevent those things from happening, we need independent investigation. And ultimately, we want to change the use of deadly force laws and take out malice in the law. And we've defined what good faith means, that a reasonable officer, what a reasonable officer would do given the circumstances at the time. There's no definition of good faith in the current law. So we defined what that means. When Senator Frock saw our bill, he said, I wish I would have wrote it.
So for the item about independent oversight, do you have a specific organization in mind to do that or create a new one?
Mm-hmm. Well, we purposely left that until after the initiative is passed, because what this initiative does is it allows people at the table that have never been at the table before, communities of color, LGBTQ, immigrants. It allows people to be at the table that wasn't there before, so that they can be working together on what that looks like for the future. And I like that. I don't think that's happening nowhere in the country. So we're very excited about that part.
All right. Also see that you have included, it's important to include tribal governments in investigations.
Exactly.
Can you talk about that?
Exactly. Well, you know, when Jackie Sawyer was killed, January, I believe, 28th of 2016, the tribe did not even know that Jackie was pregnant. They was never informed. And we just believe that when incidences happen, that the tribe council should be involved in understanding exactly what's going on right from the beginning. And they shouldn't be isolated from issues like that going on with their population. So that's very important.
All right. And where are you now in terms of signatures, and what happens after you present those to the state?
We need around 260,000 signatures by the end of the year. We have now around 270 already. We will turn in around 346 to 350 by the end of this month. And we have raised some $970,000. Amazingly, they don't make this process an easy one, but because of the amount of support we have, I think we're right on track to where we need to be. That doesn't mean we slow down. We still have our volunteers out there full-fledged. We're still doing parties for fundraising, and we want to make sure we get the job done and not slack at the end. We're not there all the way, but we're right there at the door.
And then once you present the signatures and the state acknowledges that you have enough, what happens next?
Well, then it goes to the legislators. They have an opportunity to actually make it a law. They have an opportunity to present an opposing, something opposing on their ballot or equal with it, which I don't believe it to be equal with. I think we've done the best job that can be done. Or they could just pass it to the ballot. We're hopeful that there could be some type of movement, but we are preparing for the ballot.
So if it goes to the ballot, do you anticipate any significant pushback from any national organizations? Because this obviously has significant impact as a precedent for the other 49 states.
You always want to expect that there's going to be some pushback. There's a saying, in a time of peace, prepare for war. So we are expecting, we just don't know that individual group that might be, the ones that's doing the pushing back, but we are expecting that there could be, and prepared.
So one of the major hurdles in current police procedures is the inquest that is carried out by whichever police force is the one that does the shootings. I know that it factors significantly in every shooting, and I know that the results were the same for both your brother's shooting as well as Charlena Lyles. Can you talk about that?
The inquest is a very incomplete process. Right now, there are two families that Not This Time is spokespeople for. Giovanni McDade, who was killed in Kent, and Eugene Nelson, who was killed in Kent. One of the problems on the inquest is, one of them, because there's a plethora, is that they don't provide counsel for victims. So some 88% of inquests that have happened, the victims have never had any counsel, and that is extremely problematic. Right now, we're fighting to see some type of sea change in that, because we think the process is already incomplete and unfair. So on top of that, a person goes through this inquest without counsel, when law enforcement has counsel and come in there and just sweep the table. The inquest is, when I went through the inquest with my brother, and there's this idea that the jurors exonerated the police officers. Well, that's not true. Law enforcement said that the reason they killed my brother, Shay Taylor, is because he did not comply with them. Well, in the inquest jury, all 8 jurors unanimously agreed that that was not true, that my brother did comply with police officers, right? But it's such an incomplete process that there are certain things that you can't even bring into play. The gun that they said my brother had, that they found the next day in a car that wasn't his, they said it was his. He didn't have a gun at the time of the shooting. They said he did, but he didn't. The inquest jury found out that he didn't have a gun, which I knew all along. They found some gun the next day. I'm just trying to show you how incomplete the process is. Seattle Times came out with an article saying that the gun that they found was traced back to a sheriff deputy. We couldn't bring that into the inquest process. So it's a very bad and incomplete process, and my organization is going to do whatever it can to try to challenge this process or boycott it altogether, while I'm fighting for these particular 2 families that have inquests within the next several months.
Is the inquest process, changes to that, would that be implemented by a state, like the state of Washington? Is that implemented at the local level? It's the county level.
Yeah, it's county level. It's the county level. As a matter of fact, there's some talks going on right now as we speak about changing, not being able to provide attorneys for families. There's conversation going on right now. I spoke with Lisa Dugard a few days ago, and there is actual conversations going on. I hope something is introduced real fast, because these families need at least the families need an attorney, at least. Yeah. So
Seattle Police Department's inquest procedure would also be changed at the county level?
Yeah, everything is at the county level.
So people like Dow Constantine and the others elected officials.
Yeah. I've had some of my people reach out to Dow for us to have try to have some type of conversation about this process. We haven't heard back from him yet, but there's some council people. I don't know the full details, so I don't want to try to get into it and deliver some false information. but I do know something is going on the county level right now that's being discussed about some legislation being passed about changing some things about the inquest process. Mm-hmm.
So, as if you didn't have enough already to focus on, then assuming 940 makes it to the ballot, it'll take what, 6 months to a year to bring it to a vote?
It will be on the 2018 ballot.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 2018 ballot. And after once it passes, I believe that we will have to watch over this process some 2 years or some 3 years just to make sure everything is implemented properly. Keeping our hands on things real closely. So it doesn't stop for us after it's passed. We need to be engaged in the process for several years to make sure that it is going according to the law once we implement it.
Yes, because it would appear that legislatures generally don't add teeth to things. They tend to water them down.
Yeah, but they can't water this down. If this is passed, it's passed the way that it is. They can only present something else to the ballot, but they can't water this down. This is a people's initiative, and I'm very happy about that process. So once we pass this on the ballot, it becomes law, and it's our responsibility, the community members and people at the table, to make sure that it is implemented, and we will be making sure that it is. Because we'll be at the table, and that'd be a law for us to be at the table. So it's different. This is different. This is leading. I often compare this initiative to what Massachusetts did in 2003 when they brought forth marriage equality. Whether someone believes in it or not is inconsequential. The genius of it is what I'm talking about. The beauty of the leadership that Massachusetts took and set a precedent. And once they did, you see states around the country that followed suit. It is the position that we're in right now as a state. Washington has the same opportunity that Massachusetts had in 2003. We need to also be courageous. We need to also lead. And that's what the country needs right now, some leadership. So Washington State, we must show them that.
So just about a minute left. So how can people find out more about your work and De-Escalate Washington?
Well, my website for Not This Time is www.notthisTime.global. And the website for anyone who wants to contribute or volunteer for De-Escalate Washington is deescalatewa.org. We still need volunteers, and we still need people contributing. I think we can see a sea change, a beginning of one, once we pass this initiative.
Yes, and as you pointed out, there's still going to be work to be done after.
Most definitely, and we're ready to do it.
All right. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Thanks for having me, Mike. I appreciate you.